Michael Saylor said Bitcoin is going to $10 million per coin. That's a 130 times move that would change everything. He is describing a financial shift where Bitcoin becomes the base layer for digital credit. Instead of relying on traditional banking products, capital moves into Bitcoin-backed systems that can generate yield and scale globally. In that scenario, a $200 trillion network doesn't sound unrealistic, and the 10 million number starts to follow from that. At the same time, Raoul Pal is watching the macro setup. He's pointing to a change in how liquidity enters the system. Rather than central banks expanding balance sheets aggressively, more of the flow is expected to come through bank lending tied to large-scale investment, including AI. That kind of liquidity tends to move into markets quickly, and crypto has historically reacted strongly when that happens. In this video, we're going to break down Saylor's digital credit idea and why he believes it changes long-term returns. Then we'll look at Raoul Pal's liquidity view and what it could mean for the next move in Bitcoin. And if both are correct, the conditions for a major expansion are already forming. And before we jump into it, just a quick reminder, only a small percentage of you watching are actually subscribed. If you're getting value from the videos, hit that subscribe button. It's free, it supports the channel, and you can always change your mind later. Now, let's begin.
What's the end game? The end game isn't that complicated. It's give a bank account, an 8 to 10% a year yielding high yield digital bank account to 1 billion people, drive Bitcoin to $10 million a coin, and make Bitcoin a $200 trillion network until it grows higher, and give everybody in the world an alternative to 20th century credit instruments, zero yielding bank accounts, lackluster junk bonds, private credit, or risky, rickety equities, or all of the challenging real estate investments that are difficult to manage, that are illiquid, that are immobile. And those things collectively represent the digital transformation of all the capital markets. And as we like to say in this business, in the Bitcoin community, we say, fix the money, fix the world. Digital credit is the next killer application to fix the money, and it's going to spread Bitcoin everywhere in the world, and it's going to cause Bitcoin to back all the stable coins, all the crypto tokens, all sorts of other conventional credit instruments. And it'll be a good day when the major banks and the major investors in the world all own some digital credit, or they offer digital bank accounts powered by Bitcoin.
Michael Saylor just laid out what he believes is the endgame for Bitcoin, and it is not complicated in his view. He's not talking about short-term price moves or the next cycle top. He is describing a full transformation of how capital works across the entire global system. His core idea is simple: replace traditional financial products with a Bitcoin-based system that actually performs better. Instead of holding cash in a bank account that yields close to nothing, he sees a future where people hold digital accounts backed by Bitcoin that can generate meaningful returns. He puts that range at around 8 to 10% annually, which already outperforms most savings products people rely on today. Then scale that globally. Saylor is talking about bringing this model to 1 billion people. That is where the numbers start to expand quickly. When capital moves away from low-yielding bank accounts, underperforming bonds, and difficult real estate into a single digital network, the size of that network grows into the hundreds of trillions. His estimate lands around 200 trillion, and that is where the 10 million per Bitcoin number starts to come from. What makes this more realistic today than in previous cycles is the direction institutions are already taking. Large asset managers have started allocating to Bitcoin through spot ETFs. Payment systems are integrating stablecoins. Governments are actively discussing regulation instead of ignoring the space. These are early signals of capital beginning to move. Saylor's point is that Bitcoin is not just another asset competing for attention, it is positioning itself as the base layer for storing and moving value in a digital economy. That idea sets the foundation, but it raises a bigger question about how people actually use that capital day to day.
Lots of people have different views, and you have to see Bitcoin as one pole, one polarity, and credit as the other. People that want to be completely without counterparty risk and self-sovereign, they want the commodity. But on the other hand, in your life, you buy things all the time from corporations where you rely on the company to perform. When you get in an airplane, you trust the pilot to land the plane. When you buy an iPhone, you trust Apple not to turn off your iPhone. When you go to a dentist, you trust the dentist to not stop halfway through the operation. The world is full of examples. When you watch a Netflix series, you trust Netflix to let you finish the show. When you buy electricity, you trust the power company to keep pumping the electricity. In fact, I would say there's a lot of people that want unlimited free electricity. They do not want to install a nuclear reactor in their backyard. And so what's happened here is we have created a crypto reactor, and we're using it to create credit in order to serve a group of people that don't want to do this work themselves. They don't want to wait a decade before they actually monetize their investment. They want to consistently monetize the investment every month for 120 months in a row. Who would do that? A retiree, a 3-year-old, a 12-year-old, a conservative institution, a company that has lots of consistent bills, and if they don't make their payroll in 2 months, they get shut down. People that if they miss their bills, they go to jail, right? There are plenty of institutions and individuals and investors that can't stand, they can't take a long duration capital investment. For them, they need the credit. One serendipitous result we found while we were engaged in this was that if you finance the dividends from a credit instrument by monetizing an unrealized capital gain, you've created a return of capital dividend, and that's tax deferred.
Michael Saylor's next point focuses on something most Bitcoin holders ignore at first, and that is yield. Not everyone is trying to hold an asset for 10 years without touching it. A large part of the world needs steady income, and that demand does not disappear just because a better store of value exists. He explains this by comparing Bitcoin to credit. On one side, you have pure ownership with no counterparty risk. That is the appeal of holding Bitcoin directly. On the other side, you have the real world, where people rely on companies, services, and systems every day. People trust airlines to fly safely, utilities to keep running, and businesses to deliver what they promise. That same dynamic applies to financial products. This is where digital credit enters the picture. Saylor describes a system where Bitcoin acts as the underlying asset and credit products are built on top of it to generate consistent returns. Instead of waiting years for price appreciation, investors can receive regular income. This appeals to retirees, institutions, and businesses that need predictable cash flow to operate. These are not speculative players. These are participants who cannot afford long periods without income. One key detail he highlights is how these returns are generated. By using unrealized gains in Bitcoin to support distributions, the income can be structured in a way that delays taxation. That changes how returns compound over time. It creates a situation where capital can grow without being reduced by constant tax friction. This is important because it expands Bitcoin's appeal beyond long-term holders. It introduces a model where Bitcoin is not only stored but actively used to generate income. That shift pulls in a different class of capital, and once that capital starts moving, the effects start to compound quickly. And if you want to stay ahead of these signals and know exactly when the market's heating up or when it's giving you those rare buying windows, I break it down every day in the Crypto Nutshell, my free 5-minute daily crypto newsletter. It's built to give you quick, actionable insights so you can make smarter decisions without spending hours buried in charts or headlines. You'll get clear signals on when to buy, when to take profits, and the latest news that could move markets, all delivered straight to your inbox. Just click the first link in the description, enter your email, and you're in.
One of the serendipitous results of digital credit is you can buy digital credit, you can collect the dividends tax-free, tax-deferred, you can reinvest them tax-deferred, and you can compound your wealth in a tax-deferred basis on a credit instrument, which normally you can't do it with a bond. You can't do it with a preferred stock that's a normal qualified dividend distribution. So there's a powerful compounding effect, and as you compound those dividends, you're lowering the basis in the instrument. So you collect dividends until the basis in the instrument is reduced to zero. If you then pass that instrument to your heir, if your daughter or your son inherits that instrument, they get a step-up basis. And so you got $100 of dividends tax-free. They will get $100 of dividends tax-free. And you can collect over 20 or 30 years, you can collect $200 of dividends tax-free on a $100 investment in the instrument. And what does that convert to? Well, look at this. You have $100. You invested for 21 years in T-bills. You pay taxes on it. You reinvest the dividends after tax. After 20 years, you've got $158, and you're getting $3.68 in after-tax cash flow. If you do the same thing with digital credit, after the same time period, you have 10, not 10, but 6 times as much money. You have $965, and you're collecting $107 a year on an original investment of $100. And so there's a massively powerful generational wealth transfer opportunity here for risk-averse investors and credit investors and people that never want to stomach a major drawdown, but they do want to compound their wealth in a very tax-efficient way.
Saylor's argument becomes more aggressive when he moves into how digital credit behaves over time. He is not just talking about yield, but how that yield compounds in a system where taxes and reinvestment work differently than traditional assets. In his model, digital credit built on Bitcoin allows investors to collect distributions in a way that can be structured as tax deferred. That alone changes the math. Most traditional fixed income products like bonds force investors to pay taxes on interest, which slows compounding over decades. Even equities with dividends face similar friction. Saylor contrasts this with long-term holding of Bitcoin-backed credit instruments. If returns are reinvested without immediate tax drag, the growth curve accelerates. Over time, the compounding effect becomes significantly stronger than traditional assets. He uses a simple comparison. A typical government bond over a couple of decades produces modest growth after taxes and reinvestment. But a Bitcoin-linked credit instrument, if structured correctly, can multiply capital several times over the same period. The difference is not small. It compounds into a multi-fold gap in long-term wealth accumulation. The more extreme part of his thesis is what happens across generations. He argues that when these instruments are passed down, heirs receive a reset in basis, allowing the compounding cycle to restart in a more efficient way. That creates what he describes as a generational wealth loop that is difficult to replicate in conventional finance. This is where his thesis starts to connect directly to institutional interests. Large pools of capital do not just care about upside, they care about efficiency, taxation, and long duration compounding without friction. If Bitcoin becomes the foundation for that structure, it stops being just a store of value and becomes a full financial system. And once a system like that exists, the demand for the underlying asset begins to shift in a very different direction.
This time around, it does feel like there's less levers available. Do you agree?
No. Okay. So they've told you what they're going to do, and Steve Miller made it super clear. So they don't want to use the central bank balance sheet as much if they can avoid it. And the reason being is it's a very blunt tool because it just debases the denominator, but doesn't allow for the flow of funds into the economy. And what they've said very clearly, and the changes to the SLR is all about this, is you're better off to run it through the banking system and let them provide the liquidity, because then it goes via lending. If you think about the great game being played with AI, there's no way governments can do this. They can't afford it. So it has to come from leverage from the banking system. And that's what's going to happen. And if you look what happened in Japan, they've made exactly the same change. They've started shifting, igniting the banking system, having a steeper yield curve to start allowing lending again, because the Japanese banks haven't lent for 30 years, but they're going to start lending again because Japan also knows that with the aging demographics and all of the issues that are there, the government can't fund what needs to happen because, Japan is kind of the robotic side of the equation, the automation side of the equation. It's going to have to be funded by the private sector. So there's no way, we can't just tap the Middle East for cash all the time. They don't have infinite resources either. If you think about it, somebody like Mubadala have like $300 billion. It's not that much, not in the scale of what's needed here. We need trillions and trillions of dollars.
Raoul Pal takes the conversation away from Bitcoin itself and focuses on what actually drives all risk assets over time: liquidity. His view is that the next major expansion will not come primarily from central banks printing money in a direct way. Instead, it comes from the banking system expanding credit at scale. He explains that policymakers are becoming more cautious with direct balance sheet expansion because it is a blunt tool. It increases money supply but does not always translate efficiently into real economic flow. So the preference is shifting toward using commercial banks to create liquidity through lending. That matters because lending is how money actually enters the system in practice. When banks expand credit, it moves directly into businesses, infrastructure, technology, and investment cycles. Right now, that includes artificial intelligence spending, energy expansion, and large-scale corporate borrowing. These are capital-intensive trends that require continuous financing. Raoul Pal points out that this is similar to what has already happened in places like Japan, where prolonged low growth forced policymakers to encourage bank lending after years of stagnation. The result was a gradual reactivation of credit channels rather than direct stimulus alone. He also highlights a constraint most people overlook. Governments and sovereign wealth pools are not infinite sources of capital. Even large entities like Middle Eastern funds, while powerful, cannot fund global expansion alone. That leaves the banking system as the main engine for scaling liquidity. When liquidity expands through credit creation, it tends to flow into higher risk and higher growth assets first. Historically, that includes technology, equities, and crypto markets. Bitcoin and Ethereum tend to respond strongly when this cycle begins to accelerate. This is where his view connects back into the broader thesis. If liquidity is about to expand through banks rather than central banks, the market impact can be faster and more uneven than people expect. And that creates conditions where existing trends in crypto can accelerate sharply instead of gradually. When you combine both theses, the picture becomes more extreme than either one alone. Michael Saylor is describing Bitcoin as the settlement layer of a new financial system. Not just an asset people hold, but infrastructure that credit, savings, and investment products are built on top of. In that world, Bitcoin is not competing with traditional finance on performance alone. It is replacing parts of it entirely by being more efficient at storing and moving value. That is where the idea of Bitcoin reaching $10 million per coin comes from. It is not driven by short-term speculation. It is driven by the assumption that large parts of global capital begin migrating into a Bitcoin native system. Even a partial shift of global bonds, real estate exposure, and equity savings into Bitcoin-linked instruments changes the supply-demand structure permanently. At the same time, Raoul Pal is pointing to the timing mechanism. Liquidity is the fuel. If bank lending expands aggressively into sectors like artificial intelligence, infrastructure, and global corporate investment, that liquidity does not stay contained. It flows outward into assets that are already positioned for growth. Crypto tends to be one of the fastest responders to that shift. What makes the current setup different from previous cycles is that both structural adoption and macro liquidity are moving in the same direction. Bitcoin is seeing deeper institutional integration through regulated products, while at the same time global credit conditions are loosening through the banking system rather than tightening through central policy. That combination creates a feedback loop. More liquidity supports higher asset prices. Higher prices attract more institutional participation. More participation reinforces the long-term thesis Saylor is describing. If that loop continues, Bitcoin stops behaving like a cyclical asset and starts behaving like foundational financial infrastructure. And in that kind of system, the $10 million target stops sounding like a prediction and starts sounding like a reference point for scale rather than speculation. Anyway, guys, that's all we have for today. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you all in the next video.